Hiya! So today we're going to be talking about inheritance, and I know everyone hates this topic, but really it's simple once you get to know it. It's kind of like maths, it's always the same, which is nice. So DNA is always there's only one answer, which I like that about DNA and inheritance. There's only one answer, so you know you can't be wrong in theory. Okay, so let's go through some keywords. So the first thing we need to know about is phenotype. So this is your physical appearance. It's controlled by your genotype, and it's what helps you survive or not in the wild. So it's selected for, and it determines natural selection. So let's think about all these different kinds of phenotype. It can be visual, like leaf shape or hair colour, or it could be physiological or behavioural, like blood group, presence of a protein, or like mating displays, and things like that. Okay, so like I said, these are controlled by your genotype, which is the alleles that are present in your DNA, in your genome. Genes are either expressed or not. Remember, there's a lot of genes in your DNA that are just not expressed ever, okay? And that's because we all have variation. Remember, there's a few different kinds of variation. We've got genetic variation, habitat variation, and species variation. But in this one, we're focusing on genetic variation. So that's the variation of alleles, or the variety of alleles in a population or a species. Okay? And in terms of humans, we all have 46 chromosomes, which are known as 23 pairs, because we have 23 from our mother and 23 from our father. Okay, and within those, there are hundreds of different genes and DNA, and out of all of them, probably only a few are expressed, day in, day out, the main ones. Most of them are only expressed during development and under certain types of stress as well. Right, so let's have a bit of a refresh on chromosomes. Chromosomes, like I said, come in pairs. You get one from your mum and one from your dad. During mitosis, they replicate and they look like this, like little cross shapes. That's the classic chromosome shape, isn't it? But most of the time, they're actually single copies and look like this. So again, we've got one from mum and one from dad. And in this case, they have slightly different genes. So can you see on the mum one, they've got the allele for blue eyes. And on the father's, there's the allele for brown eyes. So that's how you can inherit different kinds of combinations of genes, which end up influencing your phenotype. So when you were fertilized, when you were just a zygote, a sperm and an egg, and then, fertilization occurred, you will have got a random mix of these alleles from your parents. So in this case, look, they've inherited one blue allele and one brown allele, but because the brown allele is dominant, you will end up with brown eyes. Okay, so let's look at that, dominant and recessive. What does that mean? So we need to know some terminology here. So we need to know about recessive and dominant, homozygous and heterozygous. So you always get two alleles for the same gene. Sometimes they're the same, like up here. So if they're the same, they're said to be homozygous. If they're different, they're said to be heterozygous. The dominant allele is always expressed over the recessive one. So the dominant one here is expressed with a capital letter, and the recessive one is a lowercase letter. So in this case, the brown allele is dominant, which means it will always win out over the recessive one. And you only get the recessive phenotype being expressed if you have two recessive alleles like that one on the right there. Okay, so these can all be affected by environment and by which genes are inherited, which can be very complicated, but that's what we're going to look at in a minute. Okay, so your environment can also affect which genes are selected for, and if you are a particularly plastic species, sometimes it can affect which genes are expressed as well. But don't get that confused with when the environment alters the phenotype but not the genotype. So this is called phenocopy, when certain conditions in the environment can change what organism looks like, but it doesn't have any effect on their genes. Like leaving a plant in a dark room, it'll start to go yellow. That's nothing to do with genes, that's to do with environment. Okay? Right, so inheritance. We need to know about how to predict what phenotypes offspring will be if we know what their parents' alleles are. So this is our standard genetic diagram, or our genetic little list, and it should always look like this. Okay, so you always start with the parental phenotypes and parental genotypes. So up there we've got brown-eyed parent and a blue-eyed parent. The brown-eyed parent is heterozygous, so it's got big B, little b. And the blue-eyed parent, because blue is a recessive trait, has both of the small recessive little b's. Then we have the possible gametes. That means the possible sperm and eggs that can be produced by the parents. And these usually go in a circle so we can differentiate them. So the gametes that could be produced from the parent on the left, we can either get a big B or a little b, and the parents on the right can only produce B alleles. I don't know why I put 2. You can just put 1 if you want. And then we can figure out what the offspring will be using a Punnett square. So you put the gametes on the side, cross it out into the middle, and there you can see we will get 50% of the children being heterozygous brown-eyed and 50% homozygous blue-eyed. Okay, and we can express that down here. And this is the first generation from these parents, so we call this F1 genotypes. There you go, 50% brown, 50% blue. So you can be asked sometimes to express this as a ratio, so this would be 1 to 1. Also sometimes you're asked to do a second generation or F2 cross, which is where you cross 2 of the offspring from the original cross again. So you cross the offspring again, which is kind of weird if you do it in animals because it's a bit incestuous, but it's done with plants quite a lot, so watch out for those questions where they ask you to do an F2 generation. Alright, so when we just look at one trait, we call this monohybrid or monogenomic inheritance, which is just looking at the inheritance of one gene. So here's another example. We've just done one, but we'll do another one. Here we are, tall versus short plants. Tall is dominant, and you've got both homozygous parents, so they're both the same. So that's the tall plant, big T, and the short plant is little t, and there you are in the gametes there. So the one on the left can only produce big T gametes. Oops, sorry, just dropped my phone a little bit. And the one on the right, the short one, can only produce small t gametes. So again, we do our little Punnett square. You could have just done this 1 by 1 square, but I always like to do them 2 by 2. I don't know why, it's just like a habit. And that means 100% of the offspring will be heterozygous tall. Can you see that? So I've got the genotype there, 100% big T, little t, and the phenotype, 100% tall offspring. Just to mix it up, we can also look at 2 alleles, an inheritance of 2 different genes, which is called a dihybrid cross. And when you are writing this out, make sure you always put the dominant allele first and the same lettered alleles together, okay? But basically, everything just doubles up. Simple as. The monohybrid one, there's just 2 of everything. Easy peasy. So let's look at a tall green plant and a tall yellow plant. Green is dominant and tall is dominant like before, and they're both homozygous for all traits. So look at tall green, big T, big G. You can just see it's just doubled up. Times tall yellow, big T, and little g, because yellow is recessive, yeah? Here the gametes then can be made. So the only gametes that can be made for tall green are big T, big G, and the only gametes that can be made for tall yellow are big T, little g. Again, we're doubled up, so there's 2 in the gametes now. Then we do our cross. So yeah, this is just me realising I always do 2 by 2 crosses. I've decided to do 1 by 1 here, because there's only one possible outcome. They're all going to be big T, big G, little g, 100% tall green. Okay. Now let's do a very, very similar cross using the same rules, the same kinds of plants, but this time they're going to be tall green and both heterozygous for all traits. So look, they're going to be big T, big G, little g, crossed with the same tall green plants. Now, this is a little bit more complicated because there's some more possible combinations for gametes. We could have big T, big G, big T, little g, big G, or both the little ones, little t, little g. And the same for the other parent. Can you see? This is about as complicated as it gets, all right? So this means we'll need to do a 4x4 cross. Still very simple. It just takes time, doesn't it? So remember, everything's doubled up. 2 on the outside, 4 on the inside. The dominant one goes first. See, like here, look, big T, little t. The dominant one always goes first. And we put the same letters together. So T, T, G, G. Yeah, not T, G, T, G. God, don't do that. And I've got a few different possible combinations here, so I've coloured them in just to make it a bit simpler. We've got 9 out of the 16 being tall green, 3 out of the 16 being tall yellow, 3 out of the 16 being short green, and 1 out of 16 being short yellow. When you get this 4x4 cross, you always get this same ratio, 9 to 3 to 3 to 1. So if you remember that, when you have both parents being heterozygous and a dihybrid cross, it always comes out 9 to 3 to 3 to 1, so you don't even need to do the bloody genetic cross. You just remember it. Okay, and there's all the genotypes. Right, and that's my simple guide to inheritance. The next video coming up is going to be how we can then apply our knowledge of inheritance to a few different situations.